Chapter 70, The Hunt Begins. While his flock distracted the RECOs, Brightbill darted around behind them and desperately searched for buttons. He had once shut down his own mother with a click, and now he would do the same thing to the intruders. But he found no buttons on these robots, only smooth surfaces. Clearly, the RECOs were not designed to be shut down so easily. Giant hands swung through the air, and the geese were swatted away. Loudwing was plucked by her foot and flung to the ground. She crawled into the weeds as the others scrambled up and over the trees. A quick scan by the robots revealed that Roz was gone. The 3 RECOs turned and marched back to the airship. The door hummed open and the robots disappeared inside. And when they stepped back into the meadow, each was holding a silver rifle in his hands. The hunt for Roz was on. Without speaking, the RECOs marched away from one another, fanning out in their standard search pattern. RECO 1 marched straight toward the southern tip of the island. RECO 2 marched straight up the mountainside, and RECO 3 marched straight into the forest. Chapter 71, The Forest Assault. RECO 3 marched through the forest with a steady, stomping strides. His blocky head swiveled from side to side, searching for any sign of Roz. But he was distracted. You see, everywhere the RECO went, he was met by shrieking animals. He didn't know it, but he was in the midst of a coordinated assault. Swooper hooted orders from above. Hawks, sparrows, owls dive in front of his eyes. Fink barked orders from below. Hares, weasels, foxes dashed between his legs. The forest was seething with an army of wild animals distracting the robot, luring the terrible thing deeper into the trap. Chit-Chat leaped out from the branches and clawed at the robot's eyes, yelling, "Anyone who shows up on our island and tries to take my friend's mother away has a big problem with me." Then she leaped back into the branches. The robot pointed his rifle at the squirrel and pulled the trigger. A blazing beam of light shot through the forest and sent tree limbs crashing to the ground. It grazed poor Chit-Chat, singeing the end of her tail, but she ignored the pain and scurried up to the safety of the canopy. With each stride, the ground grew a little softer, and the robot sank a little deeper, and he was up to his waist in thick, heavy mud. His churning legs slowed to a stop, and he stood there, computing whether to move forward or backward. RECO was now an easy target. "Begin the bombardment," said Swooper. The sky darkened as a swarm of birds descended from the treetops. They swooped past the robot and splattered his face with their droppings. Bird after bird swooped and splattered. The RECO's eyes were instantly caked in filth. "Don't let up," screeched the owl. "Give it everything you've got." There seemed to be an endless stream of birds with an endless amount of droppings. RECO 3 let go of his weapon and wiped his filthy face with both his hands. That was the moment when the fuzzy bandits had been waiting for. They dashed out of the weeds, snatched the rifle with their nimble hands, and dragged it away. Tawny and Crowpoint looked on from the underbush. The buck lowered his head, and the raccoons carefully placed the rifle upon its antlers. Then the deer and the raccoons slipped into the shadows. By the time RECO 3 realised his weapon was missing, it was too late. He let out a sad electronic tone, and then the birds continued their bombardment. The robot turned and blindly trudged back through the mud. It was now time for the final stage of the plan. Broadfoot, the bull moose, emerged from the trees and stood directly in the path of the blinded robot. RECO 3 had no idea that his every step brought him closer to the mighty animal. When the robot was in range, Broadfoot turned and kicked back with his powerful hind legs. There was a sharp crack, and dung sprayed from RECO's head. The moose kicked again, crack, and the robot's head flopped to one side. A tear in his neck exposed a tangle of silver tubes, but RECO's legs kept pumping, so Broadfoot kept kicking. He pounded the robot's head with heavy hooves, denting and crushing it into an ugly shape. And with one final crack, The head broke loose, soared through the air, and squelched into the muck. The headless robot fizzed and smoked. His legs ground to a halt, and he never moved again. Chapter 72, The Mountain Rumble. RECO2 stood at the mouth of the cave. Rosm, Unit 7134, are you there? The only response was his own flat, echoing voice back. But he sensed movement somewhere down the tunnel, so he switched his headlights, raised his rifle, and marched inside. The RECO marched past animal bones and rock piles and wide cracks in the wall. His blocky head swiveled from side to side, scanning for any sign of Roz. But she was nowhere to be found, so he turned and marched back toward daylight. And then a deafening roar filled the cave. From the shadows flew a giant body. Mother Bear charged into the robot and smashed him against the wall. Then Nettle and Thorn jumped in. Together, the family went to work. They rammed his legs, they slashed his chest, they muscled him to the ground. On his way down, RECO squeezed the trigger. There was a flash of light and the walls began to crumble. Nettle grabbed her brother by the scuff and pulled him outside as an avalanche of rock thundered behind them. Mother Bear howled. The rifle exploded. Stones clanged with RECO2. The avalanche slowed and settled as the cloud of dust billowed out from the cave. Mother? Nettle peered into the darkness. I'm here, said a weak voice. The young bears dashed inside and found their mother half buried. They pulled the heavy stones from her body and dusted her off. I have broken bones, she rasped. But they will heal. Where is the robot? RECO2's headlights switched back on. Stones tumbled as the robot staggered to his feet. His body was scratched and scraped. His head was heavily dented. His left arm was completely useless. So it was tossed aside. Then the one-armed robot limped out of the cave and continued to hunt for Roz. Don't worry about me, Mother Bear growled to Nettle and Thorn. Kill the robot. With his heavy limp and grinding gears, RECO2 was easy to track. The young bears caught up with him as he was entering the grove of pines, but they didn't attack. Not yet. There was a better place to finish him off, up ahead. So they hung back and followed him across the mountainside. The distant rumble of the waterfall grew louder with each passing minute, and then a slash of white appeared through the tree. Soon the robot was standing beside the rolling, frothing river just above the falls. He was too badly damaged to leap over the falls or to wade through the rapids or to climb down the cliffs, but he had to continue to hunt for his target. So he started limping upriver in search of a safer crossing. There was a rustling. The young bears exploded out from the trees. They threw their heavy shoulders against the robot's body, and he stumbled sideways onto the riverbank. Nettle reared up and wrestled the robot, twisting and shaking him with all of her strength. RECO2 felt his feet slipping on the rocks. He felt his body tipping over and then plunged into the white water. And he brought Nettle with him. The current immediately swept Nettle toward the falls. She rolled through the rapids, crashed into one rock, and then desperately clambered onto another. RECO2 stood straight up in the river, which rushed around him. He took a step, slipped, and disappeared beneath the water. But then he was up again. Thorn ran to help his sister, but she was pointing upriver, roaring, "Use the logs!" When the younger bear turned around, he saw what she meant. A jumble of broken logs were wedged between the rocks of the rapids. And a moment later, Thorn was on top of them. With water sloshing over his back, he forced a paw between the logs and pried the top one loose. It splashed into the river and wound its way down through the rapids, only to roll harmlessly past the robot. Then it dropped out of sight. The bear tried again. He popped another log into the river, and this one spun just in time to ram its full weight into the robot's chest. RECO2 went sailing backward and sank beneath the surface. When he appeared, the river was full of heavy wooden torpedoes. One log pounded the robot's shoulder. Another slammed into his face. More logs knocked him closer and closer to the falls. The current became too much for the injured robot, and it carried him away. He grasped for anything solid that he could cling to, but the rocks were too slippery. He settled for a fistful of fur. Nettle had been hanging on to one rock this whole time, but now the robot was pulling her. She started to lose her grip. She couldn't hang on much longer. Finally, she cried out, "I'm sorry, Thorn," and she had to let go. Nettle and RECO2 surged towards the rumbling falls. The bear felt the robot release his grip. She watched him glide over the edge, then she closed her eyes and waited for the end to come. But it was not Nettle's time. Reader, what happened next is hard to believe. You see, the river didn't fall away beneath Nettle. It tightened around her. Hundreds of fish surrounded the bear. They pressed their faces into her fur, and they thrashed their tails against the current, and they slowly pushed her away from the edge. Farther and farther they went, gradually moving upriver until Nettle's brother pulled her from the river. The bears collapsed onto the riverbank, and when they looked down, they saw hundreds of fish looking back up. "Thank you," roared Nettle. "I'll never eat fish again." The fish smiled and sank into the rapids. "I thought you were dead," said Thorn, breathing hard. "So did I," Nettle laughed. "Looks like you're stuck with me for a while longer, little brother." "I'm not little." It felt good to joke, but the bears quickly turned serious. They were bruised and bleeding, and their mother was in a far worse condition. However, it would all be worthwhile if RECO2 had finally been killed. The bears crept to the edge of the cliff, and there, at the bottom of the waterfall, strewn across the wet rocks, was the shattered body of a dead robot.